So one more presenter, and our next presenter is Amy Sinclair. Amy is a senior in microbiology and Russian language. She's from Wichita, Kansas. She's going to be a fifth-year senior next year in order to finish up a little bit of both degrees, and then afterwards she's planning to attend graduate school for molecular biology, and she hopes to have a career in research. So she wants to do this for a living. Amy is presenting on herbal remedies in 20th century Slavic folklore. Amy?
Well, now for something completely different. So what started out as a project looking at various herbal remedies and their medical efficacy in pre-modern medicine Russia, it kind of turned into, I'm going to look at the person who used these and who prescribed these things. And so this woman was known as the Povitucha, and she was the Russian village midwife, specifically before the institution of communism in Russia. And so my presentation is entitled Povitucha, the Russian midwife and the westernization and modernization of childbirth in the USSR and modern-day Russia, which is just a really long-winded way of saying I'm going to give you a crash course in Russian folklore, and we're going to follow this woman and her profession, because it was actually a profession, from when it was widely practiced through the institution of medicalization and westernization of the childbirth process and afterwards. So, I'm going to talk to you a little, that's the Povitucha, by the way. This was drawn in 1764. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about folklore in general and what folklore actually is. Folklore is the culture of the common people, and more specifically, illiterate people. Because the people who knew how to read and write were elites. They had professions. They lived in urban areas. And so folklore is based on the common people, and they passed down their histories, their traditions orally. And that was the way that they preserved their culture. And what is really interesting to me about Russia in particular is that Russia is a country of dichotomies. Today, you have ancient, like people living like they did in the 1800s. I guess it's not ancient, but you have like pre-modern lifestyle in a modern country. You travel an hour outside of Moscow, and people don't have running water, and that's just a very interesting phenomenon to me. Additionally, Russia was Christianized very late, they have very strong pagan roots, and so what's very cool to me is that the Orthodox Church in Russia has made concessions to the indigenous population that it didn't make elsewhere. There are specific holidays that are only celebrated in Russia and that correspond with ancient pagan holidays. And because of this, magic was a part of everyday life for the Russian village peasant. Magic was not a religion, it wasn't a belief. Magic just was, and it was a way that people communicated with their environment, and it was a way that they could control their environment around them. And some people, anybody could learn how to manipulate magic, but some people were better at it than others. And one of those people was the Povitucha. So, childbirth was considered a very liminal time period, and what liminal means is that it was in between spaces, because childbirth brought the worlds of the living and the dead together. The Russian village peasants were ancestor venerators, which means that they did not worship ancestors, but ancestors were a part of their everyday life. When a family member died, they didn't just disappear. They were still integral to people's everyday interactions. And they have ancestor holidays, and they have holidays where they leave open their windows so that the ancestors can come visit, and they have special rooms, and they would set up basically a dinner that no one could go into these rooms. Only, it was for the ancestors to come in and take part and still be members of the family. Because from the world of the dead, the ancestors could influence the world of the living. And the words for ancestors are rod and pravodito. And so, childbirth, because it brought the worlds of the living and the dead together, pregnant women were very vulnerable during this time period. It was believed that when a woman gave birth, she gave birth to an ancestor, and that was the way that you continued your family line, or pravodito. And so women were very susceptible to the evil eye and curses, sklaziti klasio. And so pregnancy was a time of secrecy and isolation. So one of the things, and I think this is kind of ubiquitous for many cultures, is that you didn't talk about the pregnancy. You tried to hide it as much as you possibly could, because if you talked about it, it would bring the attention of other forces outside of you towards your unborn child, which could, badly affect it. And so there were various superstitions. Some of the more interesting ones was peasant women, when they were pregnant, they stopped weaving or working with thread, because if you did, that would tangle the umbilical cord around your baby. Another one is that if you looked at a fire for too long, the baby would develop a birthmark. And so there was, the pregnant woman needed to be protected from people and all kinds of natural phenomena during the course of her pregnancy and directly afterwards. The childbirth process was strictly female, because females were specially and specifically built to deal with these convergence of worlds, because females were the natural healers. And also because they gave birth and came into contact on an everyday basis with the world of the dead, they were specifically suited for it. And so males were just not allowed. Also, there were special places for the female to give birth, liminal places, and the most common was the Russian sauna, called the banya, and it was located near a body of water. And so it was in between lands, water, and earth. And also, it was just extremely practical for the childbirth process itself because it was right near water. The female was considered impure directly after childbirth, and the child as well, and were still considered vulnerable to evil forces influencing her health and her baby's health. And so during this time period, which lasted about 40 days, the female could not take part in many everyday activities like marital relations or going to church. So the pavitucha was integral in this process because she was the woman or the person who could cleanse the female. And so we're going to talk about the pavitucha. So the pavitucha was traditionally an older widowed female beyond childbearing age who had successfully raised children of her own into adulthood. She had no formal education, but she had a very practical and basic knowledge based off of observation and experience. She knew the best way to, the best position to deliver a baby based on certain factors throughout the pregnancy. She knew how to cut the umbilical cord correctly. She knew how to deliver the placenta, and various other factors that were integral in the childbirth process. But most importantly, the pavitucha possessed supernatural abilities specific for the childbirth process. Without these abilities, the child could not be properly integrated into the village society. And this was usually, the pavitucha was believed to possess these abilities, which called her to this profession. And so what she could do is that she could foretell the future of the child before it was even born. And this was usually done. The most common ritual is that she would look through the window of the woman's home before she entered, and whatever visions or objects she saw would tell her what kind of future that child would have. She knew special prayers, rites, and incantations that were integral to the birth process that would ease pain and make sure that the baby would be born healthy. She also knew specific charms and potions that could also ease the birth process and pain. And this was actually where my research started out. And so I have a couple of very interesting examples of this. Directly after the child was born, the pavitucha would generally bathe it in a bath made of yellow everlasting flowers, which were called besmertniki, and this was used to prevent jaundice, because jaundice would turn the body yellow, so if you bathed the baby in a bath of yellow flowers, it would prevent jaundice. She also prepared a mixture of water and coal that had jumped out of a fire that would help ease the birth process so the baby would jump out of the woman. So it's kind of that same mentality. And also she would give a concoction of dandelion sap that had a milky appearance to aid in the lactation process directly after birth. What was very interesting about the pavitucha was that she had special church authority. Not only was she invested with special magical powers, but she also had the backing of the church. If a child was born stillborn or was close to death, she had the authority to baptize that child. And so the child would not die without a baptism. And it was recognized by the church. And this is very interesting because baptism and death rituals were just a very specific function that the church could do. It was a way that they could maintain authority, because if a person died unbaptized, they would be considered unclean or nechistmi, and they could not be buried with traditional funerary rites. They could not be buried with their family, and they could not become part of the road or the ancestors. So they're basically ostracized for forever from their family. Ooh, I'm a little nervous. Okay. The Pavituha was also she played an integral role outside of childbirth. She performed the cleansing rites that would help integrate the woman and her child back into society. And she also, and this was very, very important, she stayed in the home of the woman after she gave birth and took up her obligations and duties, as a rural peasant. And this was extremely important because the woman, as Russian peasants lived on a subsistence level, work could never stop. So the Pavituha took over that work so the household could keep running. And she was considered, because of this, a member of an extended family. You develop very close relationships between you and the Pavituha. And she also accepted very little monetary payment for her services. This was not only practical because Russian peasants were very poor, but it also emphasized the fact that she was a member of the family, and she was usually remunerated for her services with gifts of food, clothes, and manual labor. And so the Pavituha was a very integral part of Russian village culture for a very, very long time, up until about the time that Stalin took office in 1922. And when he took office, it was the start of the Pavituhi becoming obsolete as a profession. And so medicalizing the Russian rural countryside was a huge undertaking. Stalin instituted a basic form of universal health care called zdravouchranenie, and the Russians refer to this as health protection or health preservation. And generally speaking, it was extremely successful because peasants all of a sudden had access to health care that they had never in their lives before had access to. But it was a very slow and very painful process. The medical institutionalization itself was difficult, but also the peasants were very resistant to this because disease to them, in their basic pagan mindset, was not caused by germs. They had no idea of this. It was religious. It was something that you could cure using rites, incantations. And so they were suspicious in and of itself of modern medical practice. And at the same time, Stalin tried to stamp out any religious practices involved in curing a disease, and especially in various life cycle rituals, like the childbirth process. Giving birth to a Russian village peasant, it wasn't just the production of a child and having that child be healthy. It was the production of a spiritually healthy child. It was an extremely religious process, and Stalin tried to stamp that out because communism is an atheist institution. And so that made it difficult to medicalize the Russian rural countryside. And there was a huge amount of bureaucracy going into this. As people can remember, everything about the Soviet Union was about bureaucracy. And so there were 8 government administrations superior to that of the Uchastok, which was the rural medical province. And the Uchastok had to go through 8 superior government administrations if they wanted to make any major decisions, which made any reforms to the practice after it was institutionalized very, very difficult. Here is a picture, circa 1932, of a Russian village, and it looks exactly as it did for the past 300 years. And so, What Stalin did is that he mainly instituted maternity wards in hospitals in these rural districts. And this was done, and it had an overwhelming cost. And according to a 1936 health decree, which tripled the amount of maternity ward and nursery beds, and also doubled the amount of obstetricians in the rural Uchastok areas, 75% of that cost was put on the collective farmers. And they could not sustain that because they were very poor in the first place. And so the hospitals in and of themselves had they were extremely poor quality. And there's a very interesting phenomenon that people were generally distrustful of these newly medically trained midwives for a variety of reasons. First of all, they were an outsider to a very exclusive rural community. Second of all, because of the fact that they had this basic training, they were supposed to be more knowledgeable about disease and the birth process in general, but in fact they weren't. They couldn't necessarily cure basic diseases because that was not what their training was for. And more specifically, just like as Western doctors have to take an oath, they had to as well. And so if there was ever a difficult birth, they couldn't do anything about it. They had to summon for a doctor, and many times doctors weren't available. And so essentially, if there was a difficult birth, they did nothing. And this was considered very inhumane, whereas the Pavitucha did whatever she could, and some of those practices might be considered inhuman or very dangerous to us, but at least she had done something, according to the village peasants. And also the rural midwife, the newly trained midwives, did not perform the rites that went along, that were specific and special to the birth process. Here, because of this, and because of the resistance to using these trained midwives, there was a huge propaganda machine toward telling people, don't go toward your traditional source of healthcare. And so here, you have a poster saying, Von Zachranie Omini Nichat, Lish Obirayut Ikrea Chat. And it's quack doctors out. They do not cure, only rob and maim. And these were posted everywhere in the village community. They had success instituting doctors called Felcheri and Vrachi, and they had success because these people could cure basic diseases. And because they weren't specifically midwives, it was okay that they didn't know about these special rites. But because the living conditions were extremely poor in these areas, the USSR had to mandate that these people go out and serve in these rural areas because they did not want to go out there. And so they developed very impersonal relationships, not like what the peasants were used to or assumed to do, because of the fact that these people did not want to be there. And many women described the process of birth as like being on a conveyor belt. Women gave birth with other women, like 7 to 8 in a room, and doctors would induce or delay the birth based on their convenience and their schedule. So what is the modern birth ritual like now? What's very interesting to me is that the belief that females are properly suited to heal, as a profession, doctors are overwhelmingly female, even today. Fathers are still generally prohibited from even entering the maternity ward. Doctors that know about the old ways, post-starinki, are awarded special respect. I read of one case study where a woman was having a difficult birth process, and instead of using forceps that modern doctors would use to help bring the baby out of the birth canal, the doctor wrapped a sheet around the woman's stomach and pulled on both ends, which was a practice that the Pavituchi used. And this really comforted the female. And a lot of the traditional superstitions still remain. Secrecy is still a big part of it. You don't talk about your pregnancy at all. And during the Soviet era, secret baptism was a widespread event. Urban women would take their babies into a rural area to have them baptized because religion was more tolerated. And there was also a lot of self-baptism. Modern midwives, called akusherki, are still given gifts after the birth, just like the Pavituchi were given gifts as well. And there is currently development of spiritual midwifery, or the Vuchnovenie akusherstva. that is similar to the home and natural birth movement in America, except these women call themselves Russian Orthodox midwives. And what they do is all natural, but they use the charms, herbs, and prayers that the old Pavitulki used. So, in conclusion, the Pavitulki were important and respected figures in peasant society who played an integral role as an intercessor of the magical and religious process of childbirth. Although they faded out as a profession, many of their practices remain through the modernization of medicine in the USSR and Russia today. Bye.